and policy with the land remediation section of the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy. I'm joined today by Peter Yan,
and climate change strategy. I would like to start my presentation by acknowledging with respect that this work is conducted in New Westminster, which is located on unceded traditional territories of Hochmanlam-speaking Kakezi First Nation, also known as New West First Nation, as well as all Coast Salish peoples. I'm gracious for being a visitor on this land and strive to be mindful of the connection to it holds to the indigenous peoples of these territories and animals and plants we share this place with. Next slide, please, Cindy.
Thank you, Peter. Environmental Management Act grants the director authority to establish a protocol for specifying requirements for any investigation, analysis, interpretation, assessment, and preparation of remediation plan or any other activity included in the definition of remediation. In section 1 sub 1, I'm citing section 64 sub 1 sub C. It also gives authority to establish substantive and procedural requirements for persons planning, conducting, or reporting on the remediation of a contaminated site, which may be different for sites contaminated with particular types of contamination, as per section 64 sub 1 sub D, and establishing formats for summaries of site conditions and remediation plans for the purposes of their entry into the site registry. That's section 64 sub 2 sub M. Next slide, please, Cindy. And back to you, Peter.
Thank you, Valentina. Protocol 17 specifies the forms required by a director for notification of independent remediation, a supplement to independent remediation reporting requirements in section 54(2) of the Environmental Management Act, sections 57, 1.2 and 2 of the Contaminated Sites Regulation, and then Protocol 12, site risk classification, reclassification and reporting, notification of likely or actual migration of substance prescribed in sections 57.1 and 1.1 and 60.1 of the Contaminated Sites Regulation, and summary of site condition pursuant to sections 39.3.2 and 63.1 F.1 of EMA and prescribed in section 7.1 of the Contaminated Sites Regulation. I would like to note that summary of site condition form was previously schedule 1.1 of the CSR, and now it has been moved to Protocol 17 for consistency. Please note, since the mentioned forms are prescribed by Protocol 17, no modifications of the forms are allowed. The responsible person must use the forms specified in the protocol. Other reporting formats will not be accepted. Next slide, please, Cindy. Prior to February 1st, 2021, the title of the protocol was Forms for Notification of Independent Remediation and Migration, since it only included Notice of Independent Remediation and Notice of Migration of Contaminants forms. Excuse me. For consistency with EMA provision in section 39.3, the summary of site condition forms was moved from schedule 1.1 of the CSR to Protocol 17. Accordingly, to reflect the changes, the title of the protocol has been changed to Site Remediation Forms. During the revision, some typos identified in the previous versions have been corrected. For example, evacuation and disposal in section 8 of the Notice of Independent Remediation form has been corrected to excavation and disposal for soil remediation strategy. Next slide, please, Cindy. The requirements for submission of the notice of independent remediation, notice of migration of contaminants, and summary of site condition have not changed. The ministry noticed that in the past, some notices of independent remediation and notices of migration of contaminants were not submitted within the timeline specified in the contaminated sites regulation. Please note that failure to comply with provisions of the regulation or protocols is an offense. According to Section 120(17) of EMA, the responsible person may be fined for up to $200,000 a day or imprisoned, or both. We would like to bring to your attention that according to Section 57(1.2) of the Contaminated Sites Regulation, a person who has duty to provide notification to a director of commencement of independent remediation must do so within 3 days after the commencement of any remediation activity. Please note that based on the requirements of Protocol 12, a site risk classification report and exposure path questionnaire, if applicable, must also be submitted along with notice of independent remediation initiation, barring any exemptions. The notice of independent remediation and the site risk classification report should be submitted to the Site Information Advisor at advisor.siteinformation@gov.bc.ca. Sections 57(1.1) and Section 60.1 of the Contaminated Sites Regulation require a responsible person to provide written notification to neighboring site owners and a copy of the notification to a director. Such notification must be made within 15 days after the responsible person becomes aware of the migration or likely migration of each substance to the neighboring site. Note that Protocol 12 requires that the site risk classification report and an exposure pathway questionnaire, if applicable, are also submitted along with the notice of migration of contaminants. Again, there may be some exemptions to this requirement. The notice of migration contaminants and the site risk classification reports should also be submitted to the Site Information Advisor at advisor.siteinformation@gov.bc.ca. So, when do you need to submit a summary of site condition form? The form must be submitted when applying for contaminated site service application as contaminated site service or as part of a high-risk site submission, as may be required by Protocol 12. In these scenarios, the summary of site condition form must be submitted along with a contaminated site service application package or a Protocol 12 package. Next slide, please, Cindy. All forms are also available on our website in a available PDF format. The link to the web page is listed on this slide. We are receiving feedback from our stakeholders that they are experiencing issues with downloading the forms. This is a government-wide problem that is related to outdated software used to create forms and compatibility with internet browsers. There's no current solution to this problem. Only workarounds if the public is having troubles accessing the forms. Instructions to access the forms, if they don't download automatically, are included on the forms page, and we are also sent out recently WISE site remediation news. Next slide, please. That brings me to the end of Protocol 17 presentation. Just a few closing remarks. We will hold any questions directly related to Protocol 17 until after the Protocol 16 presentation. Please submit any inquiries related to Protocol 17 to the remediation FAQ inbox. With that, I will pass it to the Protocol 16 team.
Great, Peter, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Alan McCammon. I'm the manager sponsor responsible for Protocol 16, determining the presence and mobility of non-aqueous phase liquids and odorous substances. As a member of the management team for the land remediation section, I lead a unit called the Remediation Assurance Unit. Next slide, please, Cindy. I am speaking to you today from North Vancouver and would like to acknowledge with respect that I live and work in the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I'm joined today by two speakers and colleagues of mine who are the co-leads for Protocol 16, Liliana Gerardi and James Plett. Liliana, please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thanks, Alan. Cindy, the slide hasn't changed. There you go, thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Liliana Gerardi, and I am a Senior Contaminated Sites Officer in the section. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that today, I am speaking from the ancestral, traditional, and unceded Aboriginal territories of the Coast Salish peoples, and in particular the Coquitlam, Musqueam, Squamish, Stolo, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations.
Good afternoon. My name is James Plett, and I'm also a Senior Contaminated Sites Officer. And I would like to respectfully acknowledge the Lekwungen speaking peoples whose traditional territory I'm on today, as well as the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and Saanich people whose historical relationship with this land continues today. Next slide, please, Cindy.
Thanks, James and Liliana. The Environmental Management Act grants the director authority to establish protocols for specifying requirements for any investigation, analysis, interpretation, assessment, preparation of a remediation plan, or any other activity included in the definition of remediation in Section 1, Sub 1, under the authority of Section 64, 1C. The director also has the authority to establish substantive and procedural requirements for persons planning, conducting, or reporting on the remediation of a contaminated site. And these may differ for sites contaminated with particular types of contamination. That's under the authority of 64 1D. Also, there's an authority for classifying sites in accordance with risk. Next slide, please, Cindy. So, consistent with the Environmental Management Act and Contaminated Sites Regulation, Protocol 16 specifically establishes substantive and procedural requirements for persons planning, conducting, or reporting on remediation, evaluates site conditions for classifying sites as high risk based on an evaluation of risk to both human health and the environment, and describes the circumstances when two types of non-aqueous phase liquids, that is specifically dense non-aqueous phase liquids or DNAPLs, and light non-aqueous phase liquids, also known as LNAPLs, are considered present, mobile, and migrating. Schedule 3.1, Part 2, and Schedule 3.1, Part 3 of the Contaminated Sites Regulation contain environmental quality standards for non-aqueous phase liquids and odorous substances. For all land uses, the schedules list those standards as not present. And in footnotes 15 and 16 of Schedule 3.1, Part 2, and footnotes 10 and 12 of Schedule 3.1, Part 3, further explain that soil must be remediated so that these substances are not present in quantities in excess of those acceptable to a director. This protocol provides the director's requirements in the context of these footnotes and the standard not present. In addition, The protocol describes the circumstances when two types of NAPL, the dense and the light non-aqueous phase liquids, are considered present, mobile, and migrating. So at this point, I'll pass the presentation on to James and ask Cindy again to move to the next slide. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. Some of the updated definitions and newly introduced terms included in the P16 update will be mentioned here and will be discussed in more detail in the following slides. The definition for NAPL was updated for accuracy and clarity, as the previous definition defined it as a liquid that does not dissolve in water and forms a separate physical density phase from water. However, NAPL does dissolve slowly, ultimately forming dissolved phase plumes, and the defining characteristic of NAPL is the separate phase when in contact with water, hence the new definition as shown on the slide. The previous definition for mobile NAPL was a non-aqueous phase liquid that is capable of moving or is moving in environmental media as defined in a protocol issued by a director. It was changed to more clearly include the conditions of section 3.2 of the updated protocol, which define it as shown on the slide here. And a migrating NAPL is a new term that was introduced in the updated protocol P16 and will be discussed in more detail on the following slide. Next slide, please, Cindy. P16 was updated and includes new terms and definitions as were previously mentioned. The change was to reflect and be consistent with common NAPL science from institutions such as Interstate Technology and Regulation Council, ITRC, in the United States, and the pending CSAP toolkits. Note, the figures on this slide illustrate LNAPL. However, DNAPL is analogous, but will occur at the bottom of the aquifer and or the well screen due to the density differences. As can be seen in the upper figure, a migrating NAPL expands due to NAPL head differences and high NAPL saturation in soil, usually occurring shortly after release or early in the life of the NAPL body. Note, DNAPL could continue migrating for longer periods of time. It will be present in monitoring wells and actively expanding both laterally and potentially vertically. In the lower figure, NAPL is present greater than residual saturation and will be present in monitoring wells installed in the contaminant plume, but the NAPL plume is no longer spreading. There is no longer a NAPL head driving force, so the NAPL body is stable. Next slide, please, Cindy. Previously, Protocol 16 contained criteria for LNAPL and DNAPL mobility, and mobility exemptions to indicate high-risk conditions were no longer present on site. The updated P16 does not change the criteria for mobile LNAPL or DNAPL, but as mentioned previously, the term migrating NAPL was added and the protocol was changed to reflect that addition. Now all mobile sources are considered to have the potential to migrate, resulting in the NAPL body expanding both laterally and vertically, unless it can be shown to not be migrating using criteria, which will be discussed by Liliana in the following slides. Next slide, please, Cindy, and over to you, Liliana.
Thanks, James. So this protocol is designed to explain the progression from presence of NAPL to when NAPL is mobile and has the potential to cause contaminant migration. The left side of this slide explains when LNAPL is considered present. As we can see, to determine presence, the free phase liquid must be found in soil or in groundwater in monitoring wells at a thickness greater than 2 millimeters. From there, we move on to determining if LNAPL has the potential to migrate. And as we can see, LNAPL is considered mobile when one or more of the criteria on the right side of the slide are present. So if LNAPL is present over an area greater than 10 square meters on the land surface, and by that we mean a pool of NAPL on the soil. Another criteria is if LNAPL is present in fractured bedrock. Quarterly groundwater monitoring events indicate increasing thickness of LNAPL in monitoring wells. Quarterly groundwater monitoring events indicate advancement of LNAPL across a monitoring well network, or LNAPL is measured in the subsurface over an area greater than 50 square meters, or at least one of the conditions, as explained in section 3.2.1 of the protocol, are present. And these conditions are seasonal water fluctuation that exceeds 1 millimeter, hydraulic ratings that exceed 0.01 meters over meter for different soil compositions as listed in table 1 of the protocol, the section in the protocol. Preferential pathways intersect zones containing LNAPL with a thickness exceeding 0.3 meters, and LNAPL thicknesses exceed values indicated in table 1 of the section. Next slide, please, Cindy. The same progression is explaining the protocol for DNAPL. On the left side of the slide are the criteria determining if DNAPL is present, and is as follows. Free-phase liquid is found in soil or on the soil surface. Free-phase liquid is found in monitoring wells at thickness greater than 2 millimeters, or individual DNAPL substances are detected in water at concentrations exceeding 1% of the theoretical solubility limit. I would like to mention that theoretical solubility limits that we accept are the FISPROB values found in the groundwater model in Technical Guidance 13. Now, on the right side of the slide are the conditions used for determining if DNAPL is considered mobile. These are if DNAPL is present in fractured bedrock, DNAPL is present over an area greater than 10 square meters on the land surface, quarterly groundwater monitoring events indicate advancement of DNAPL across a monitoring well network, or individual DNAPL substances are detected in water at concentrations exceeding 10% of the theoretical solubility limit. Next slide, please, Cindy. Under this protocol, all mobile NAPL sources, as determined under the criteria specified in the previous 2 slides, are considered to have the potential to migrate until any of the following conditions are met. Quarterly groundwater monitoring events for 1 year with at least one of them in low water table season provides evidence that LNAPL conditions at the site have not changed over time. Historical monitoring data with at least 2 years of groundwater monitoring results for a site has provided evidence that the NAPL plume is stable and not migrating, or multiple lines of evidence showing reduced potential for NAPL migration followed current science-based approaches. Next slide, please, Cindy. It should be noted that the new NAPL terminology has also been added to section 4.1.1 of Protocol 12. Condition 1, mobile NAPL present, which now says if mobile NAPL is present at a site, the site is classified as high risk until it can be demonstrated that the NAPL source is not migrating. And by that, we mean spreading or expanding. Next slide, please, Cindy.
We received 27 comments on changes to P16, and we'd like to go over some of the main stakeholder comments. The first one, it's not clear why the introduction of a new term, migrating NAPL, was required and how that would be different from mobile LNAPL. As mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, NAPL terminology was updated to be consistent with general advancement of NAPL science and is now consistent with the definitions used by ITRC, Interstate Technology and Regulatory Council, and the pending CSAP toolkits on monitored natural attenuation. Additional comments were, will the ministry be providing an updated table with theoretical solubilities for regulated substances? And for parameters with a range of theoretical solubilities, does the ministry have guidance on which value to select? We received several comments regarding what theoretical solubility values to use. As we mentioned earlier, the solubility limits that are acceptable are the ones used on the groundwater model from Technical Guidance 13 under the column FISPROB theoretical solubility values. Next slide, please, Cindy. Back to you, Liliana.
Sorry, I was muted. As we wrap up our presentation, we would like to remind you to stay up to date with land remediation work. Please subscribe to Site Remediation News located on the webpage at the bottom of the slide. That's the commercial. Next slide, please, Cindy. Please submit any inquiries related to Protocol 16 to the remediation FAQ inbox, and as shown in that slide. And as a final wrap up, thank you everyone for attending the webinar. The Ministry appreciates your attendance and time spent joining us today. Now we can answer the questions we have received. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I do have a number of questions in the lineup right now. The first one is seems to be directed to Peter. The previous version of Summary of Site Condition did not have the format of Ministry of Environment reviews. Does the new version have that now? Peter, is your mic unmuted?
Sorry, I was talking to myself again. Yeah, as I mentioned in the presentation, the summary of site condition form have not been updated or changed during this stage amendments. All the changes or any recommendations you can send it in, and then we will consider it during the next round of CSR amendments. Is that correct, Valentina? Yeah.
Next question. Our next question, for mobile migrating LNAPL, are all conditions listed in the table need to be met or just one or more?
It's just one or more. So any
Okay.
of them need to be present.
Okay. Our next question comes from Eva. Regarding the financial penalty or fine for not submitting the NIR within 3 days of the start of a remediation activity, who is responsible for making the determination of a penalty? LRS?
I could try to answer that one. It's Alan. Yeah, basically when it comes to compliance and compliance verification and potentially up to compliance enforcement, it's the decision that the regulator, the Ministry of Environment, and duly appointed officials would make based on the circumstances that we're aware of.
Thank you, Alan. Our next question is for Liliana. Do the theoretical individual solubility limits used to determine the percentage solubility DNAPL account for reduced solubility for chemicals in DNAPL mixtures?
No, they do not. But again, that would just be to determine if NAPL is mobile. You can use new lines of evidence to demonstrate that it is not migrating.
Okay. Thank you, Liliana. Our next question. What is the source document for the NAPL thickness tables in Table 1 of Protocol 16?
That came from a document prepared by the Science Advisory Board a while back, and that's the one we used in the protocol.
Okay, thank you. We now have a question from Blair. Protocol 12 does not distinguish mobile from migrating LNAPL. Will the ministry be updating Protocol 12 and the form in Protocol 12 to reflect the new Protocol 16 language?
I can try to answer that. The new term of migrating DNAPL is included in the new version of the P12. However, yeah, the question, the form itself is still using mobile NAPL, which, as for the initiation stage of the site risk classification, it's still valid, or you can, it's still the principle, one of the two principles to classify the site as a high risk. However, during the site risk reclassification stage, you can prove that the NAPL, regardless DNAPL or LNAPL, is not migrating, it's only mobile within a very limited area, then you're okay to reclassify and then submit your reclassification package. Hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Peter. Our next question is from Blair as well. Given the punishments for not disclosing the commencement of independent remediation, can the ministry provide a regulatory definition for what independent remediation entails, and thus when an activity formally begins? Somebody like
That's
to take...
an excellent question. I'm chewing on it right now. Probably not really clear. I also want to take a step back just for a moment because I want to clarify my earlier question. It was a little out of left field. I wasn't really prepared for it on the compliance. Just to make it clear to everybody that the regulator, our program, the Ministry of Environment Land Remediation section, we have the information that will allow us as a regulator to make determinations about compliance with anything, not just this protocol, but the full range of things where there's requirements. And we will make an assessment of the information that we have in front of us about whether we think something's in compliance or not. The part I was a little too quick on my previous comment regarding who would make judgments about penalties and things like that, that can go two primary ways. There can be administrative monetary penalties that might apply to a particular circumstance, and our program would be looking very closely at that and determining what may or may not be appropriate in that context. But if there's non-compliance that it is decided through the process needs to be judged by a court, of course the court will make the decisions on the matter from top to bottom, including any penalties. Okay, so just to clarify that, and maybe Cindy, since that was a little long-winded, could you just repeat the last question about the independent remediation?
I'll be happy to do that for you, Alan. Given the punishments for not disclosing the commencement of independent remediation, can the ministry provide a regulatory definition of what independent remediation entails, and thus when an activity formally begins?
Right. It's an excellent question again, and correct me if I'm wrong, colleagues, but there's no specific definition of independent remediation. However, there's a very broad definition of the term remediation, and it includes everything from the first air photo you look at about a site, right up to the end when you're super happy your engineering works are appropriately managing risks at the site, and you've just been the happy recipient of a certificate of compliance to endorse that. So it's the entire spectrum. I believe the wording for the trigger of the duty turns on the handling or the management of contaminated materials. We would all need to just go in there and look at that wording where it says that a person is required to give notice of commencement of independent remediation, and just look clearly at that wording to determine when the duty arises. Okay? And then the clock would start ticking on when that had to be delivered to the ministry.
Thank you, Alan. We have another question here. Spills can result in NAPL on surface greater than 10 square meters. Emergency response to spills does not require NIR or SRCR. Does that mean then that upon a cleanup of a spill at a site was never considered a high-risk site if any NAPL at the surface greater than 10 square meters was cleaned up during the emergency response?
You want me to answer that, Peter, or you want to answer it?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, that is correct. That site would not be classified as high risk because for classifying a site with high risk, you have 90 days for cleanup or to remove your high risk conditions before we classify the site as high risk. So if it's a spill that's cleaned up in less than 90 days, your site is not high risk.
Okay. Thank you. Next question.
Other than that, I just want to make another point other than Liliana's just answered. The spill response is exempt from P12 first. Second, with the new section of the EMA and then the new spill regulations, The spill site now is under the management of the spill team.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Our next question is from Francini. Before, for small excavations, we could just wait and submit the NIR at once, sometimes a week later. Can this still be done, or would that be a penalty?
Right. I don't know the basis upon which you may have waited, but basically it's just looking clearly at the written requirement. We don't, as a program, have any kind of discretion to change the law, whether it's the statute, the regulation, or the protocol. So please just carefully review those requirements. I'm sorry, I can't just off the top of my head remember that wording, but if you need to get an NIR commencement in first, in other words, your remediation wasn't done so quickly as you could get them both together, they are separate notifications. That's my understanding.
Okay, thank you. Our next question comes from Ben. Is migrating Napple also considered a high-risk site?
Yes.
Okay.
Short answer, yes.
That was a good answer. Okay, and we have Andrew asking the next question. When minor technical issues are identified in the forms, is the Ministry of Environment able to make the changes directly and make a quick fix, excuse me, or if there is a contracted service, is there an expected timeline?
I'll take that.
Okay.
As a manager sponsor for Protocol 17, there is a due process. If somebody brings up an issue to our attention with the protocol, there is a due process. We don't just jump and do things. We work with this. We typically review the policy if any needs to be done for every change, and then we make the change. That's due process with the government.
Thank you. Our next question is from Joe. Can the NIR still have initiation and completion all at once? And what is the time limit on that?
I think so. Just as Alan mentioned, if the independent remediation will be completed within 3 days, or just with possibly half day or whatever the reasonable time frame within, then you can submit both initiation and completion form at the same time. However, according to the section 57 1.2, you still need to submit the NIR initiation, regardless it's a NIR initiation or both completion and initiation, to the director within 3 days of the commencement.
Okay, thank you. So we do have a couple more questions from Francini looking for more clarification. But if it is a spill, it is still required to submit an NIR, right? Because it even has an area to add the number. And then the second part of the question was, so we can send the initiation and completion at once?
The spill in the initiation of NIR for the spill is exempt. It is prescribed in CSR. So that's why SRCR is exempt, because the trigger for SRCR is NIR initiation. However, NIR completion is still required for the spill response.
Thank you, Peter. We have a question from Jennifer. For spill response, is there now a requirement for initiation notice or only a requirement for the notice of independent remediation completion?
That's the same question, I think.
Yeah, I think Peter just answered that question. Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. Our next question is from Tracy. Protocol 16 and the contaminated sites regulation schedules note that a site is contaminated if NAPL is present at the site and would be considered remediated under section 17.1 of the CSR if NAPL is removed and considered not present. Section 17.1 relates to the numeric remediation. Can the Ministry of Environment confirm that NAPL remediation can be done using risk-based solutions, which results in the NAPL remaining present on the site?
Yes, you can use risk-based solutions. However, your NAPL has to be stable. So your NAPL cannot be migrating. So you can remediate risk. You can get a risk-based certificate for a site that has NAPL in it, but it cannot be mobile NAPL.
Okay, we have a question now from James. Is site remediation considered a trigger for management of contaminated soils?
You know, I can try answering this one, and we've gone back and forth on this, and I think the answer we landed on was yes. Because risk remediation, it's also considered remediation. So it would still be considered a trigger for an NIR. And
Okay.
I'm not sure, but, and I know we've had this question in the past. So we might have to get back to you on that one, James, once I see Alan's thinking and Valentina
Well, just,
thinking.
yeah, you see me thinking, right? Can you just reread it, Cindy, quickly? I just want to see if I heard it right.
Just a sec, I just need to scroll up for that then.
Okay,
Is
sorry.
site remediation considered a trigger for management of contaminated soils?
Well, just based on those words, site remediation being, all the activities one could do for the purposes of investigating and cleaning up a site, is that a trigger? Would those kinds of activities be a trigger for managing contaminated soil? I mean, all I would comment on that is that it may very well be that any given site remediation might involve the need to legally manage contaminated soils. I'm not sure if I had heard the question quite the same way you did, Liliana, but that's what I heard.
Okay. Peter, our next question's for you from Blair. So if I have completed an investigation before a trigger requires me to submit a Protocol 12 submission and have in my possession data that shows my plume is mobile but not migrating, then if I understand your answer correctly, I have to submit a Protocol 12 form saying I have a high risk condition mobile, and then follow this up immediately with a follow-up form to make my site not high risk?
The short answer is no. You can, the new form, there's an option you can classify sites as risk managed high risk site or pending. There are 4 options. If you can demonstrate that the NAPL is not migrating, you can classify the site as a non-high risk. However, you need to provide lines of evidence and the technical or any arguments you have to support your determination.
Thank you. Our next question. Regarding an NIR initiation, for instance, if you are removing an oil tank but no testing has been previously completed, and if, for example, you don't know if contamination is present, but subsequent confirmatory testing reveals contamination, when would the clock start for submission of an initiation of independent remediation?
3 days. And it was the one you remove the soil.
Okay, so, and then James, who had earlier asked if site remediation is considered a trigger for management of contaminated soil, has further explained that that was risk remediation that he was asking about.
Fair enough, and I think Liliana maybe got that and I didn't.
Oh, okay, super. I don't have any other questions in, oops, Andrew's just sent through another question. As Andrew's saying, sorry, my question was only about minor technical glitches in the forms. An example would be in the new summary of site condition form. There are some text restrictions that don't allow us to input the full chemical name. For minor technical items like this, is the Ministry of Environment able to make these changes themselves, or is this a contracted service that presumably takes more time?
Andrew, I would appreciate if you share your feedback with us, and then we'll get on that. I can't provide an exact timeline.
Okay, thank you, Valentina. So to follow up on Peter's answer, this is it remove the soil from the site or excavation?
It's, I believe the question is related to the clock start counting for like, for example, a tank removal. Tank removal is not a remediation. Remediation is only when you remove contaminated soil and or contaminate groundwater from sites or install any treatment system for vapor, for soil, for any media. So that's considered to be a remediation activity. So which is clearly stated in the 57 1.2 of the CSR. And yeah, so I believe it's not like, oh, I don't know the soil is like clean soil or contaminated soil. When I remove it, at that time, it's really your professional judgment. You will treat that soil as clean soil, or you will treat that soil as a contaminated soil. That's your professional judgment.
Thank you, Peter. Our next question is from Aaron. Section 57 indicates NIR is required within 3 days of commencement of handling, management, or treatment of contamination. Can this be the date of finalization of the risk assessment?
That's really good, great question. I think we may need some more time to discuss on that. Yeah.
Okay, Aaron, they can get back to you on that.
Yeah, can you please just send that that question to the remediation FAQ, please?
Thank you, Peter. Liliana, it's been asked, could you please repeat your answer regarding risk management reporting requirements?
I would love to if I remember what I said. Well, I guess it depends on what the real question was. If the question was, do they need to submit an NIR for risk site that they're not doing any active work on it, but just risk assessing it, and do they need an NIR for that? If that's what the question is, my understanding is yes, you need to submit an NIR, even if there's no physical remediation happening. If that was not the question, please send it to the remediation FAQs and we'll get back to you.
Thank you. Our next question. If a UST is found during a development project and soil is contaminated, but the client decides to wait until a later time to remediate, when are we to submit the NIR?
After commencement of independent remediation, which means once you move the soil or groundwater or any contaminants associated with that UST.
Thank you. We still have 10 minutes if anybody has any further questions. That was the last question that we do have in our lineup at this time, though. No, it doesn't look like any other questions are coming in. I'll turn it back over to you, Valentina.
Well, with that, I just wanted to thank everybody for your time, and thanks for being with us today and for your tricky questions. We all appreciate that, and we'll get back to people who asked questions but didn't quite get the answer, or the answer was a little bit more specific to deal with during the webinar. So we'll get back to you with the responses. And we hope that you will all attend the last webinar that is specifically questions and answers, and we'll have some good time discussing our various issues. Thanks again, and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.